attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, welcome to today's webinar, Remove a Highway, Improve a City, hosted by the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network and is partially funded by the U.S. EPA Office of Community Revitalization and is managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website, smartgrowth.org, that serves as your one-stop on the web for the most current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. We provide news and information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtually recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one of a series of webinars. I encourage you to visit the website and subscribe to our e-newsletter to get the latest news and information about smart growth and to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also find out about planning initiatives and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association. To log your CM credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Remove a Highway, Improve a City. You can also search for event number 917-8341. This webinar has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. Today's webinar is the first of 2 webinars on urban highway removal that we are doing in conjunction with the Congress of the New Urbanism. A second webinar will be announced soon, looking at this topic in more detail. So to get started, our speakers today are Peter Park, John Norquist, and Ben Crowther. Peter J. Park is a city planner and educator who has led innovative transportation and land use planning practices for more than 25 years. His work focuses on creating urban walkable places of lasting value through the replacement of in-city highways with enriched street networks, effective transit-oriented development, and form-based codes. Peter has served as planning director of both Milwaukee and Denver and oversaw the removal of an elevated highway in downtown Milwaukee, numerous transit-oriented development planning efforts in Denver, including the development of the Denver Union Station, and comprehensive citywide rezoning code updates in both cities. In 2013, Peter authored Rethinking Highways in American Cities, New Opportunities for Leadership, with the support of CNU and the Ford Foundation. In 2012, he prepared the foreword to The Life and Death of Urban Highways, published by the Institute for Transportation and Development. He has collaborated with the IDTP on work related to freeway removal and TOD in Mexico City, Mexico, and Chennai, India. Peter is an adjunct professor at the University of Colorado, Denver, where he teaches urban planning and urban design studios and seminars. Previously, he taught at Harvard Graduate School of Design and the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. John Norquist's work promoting new urbanism as an alternative and antidote to sprawl's social and environmental problems draws on his experience as big city mayor and his service as president and CEO of the Congress for the New Urbanism from 2004 to 2014. Under his leadership as mayor of Milwaukee from 1988 to 2004, the city experienced a revision of the city's zoning code and reoriented development around walkable streets and public amenities, such as a 3.1-mile river walk. He led the successful fight to remove the Park East Freeway in Milwaukee and replace it with a boulevard and tax-based supporting development. Norquist is the author of The Wealth of Cities and has taught courses in urban planning and development at the University of Chicago, Marquette University, DePaul University, and the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's School of Architecture and Urban Planning. He served for a year as the John M. DeGrove Eminent Scholar at Florida Atlantic University. John writes articles, lectures, and is working on a book about federal programs that help and hurt cities. He and his wife, Susan Mudd, live in Chicago with their daughter, Catherine. Ben Crowther manages the Highways to Boulevards and Freeways Without Futures initiatives at CNU. He first encountered new urbanism while conducting research for his doctoral dissertation on architecture, community, and street design in the Roman Empire. He holds a Master of Arts in Humanities from the University of Chicago and a BA in Classics from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Texas at Austin. Following our presentations, our panel permits. You can sit on the right side of your screen. Now I'm going to turn it over to Peter to get us started. Welcome, Peter.
Can we hear?
Yes, we're good.
Yeah. I'm happy to be here and talk about how we remove highways and improve cities. There's a question that we'd like to start out with and just ask, are you currently engaged in a freeway removal campaign? And just let us know, if you are you deep into it, or you're just getting started thinking about it, or you're not, and you're maybe just starting to get interested in the topic? So there's a poll right now. You could submit your answers, and it just helps us to understand who we have joining us today. All right, well, this is, let's see if we might be able to, hopefully after today, change more of those to yes, and we're thinking about it. And just as a starting point, I guess what I'd like to share is a general facing highways with street networks in cities. And also, but to start with some of the basic premise of what this idea is about. And fundamentally, I don't think that these folks thought that when the actual experience. But you know what? A lot of side of the highway. So it's a question of today, we have a great opportunity to rethink these highways and look back and figure out what we learned from an era of building highways across America, but also that cut through our cities. And one of the opportunities is recognize that our American infrastructure is in need of upgrade. As many of you might be aware, the ASCE has been grading the America's infrastructure, and most recently, there again was a very similar kind of trend until about 2000, right? And so this is good news, and a significant opportunity for us to think about how we reorganize and we all are very aware of the social effects on travel demand of modern technology. So technology-enabled shared mobility services are lessening investment in our public infrastructure. ITT tracking this in an initiative called Highways Without Boulevards. And so there are a great number of resources in terms of opportunity, great places to learn about where this is happening. Cities, since if I'm traveling along I-70 across Colorado on the beautiful interstate, I don't want to be interrupted if I'm trying to connect between cities. In Texas, right, in fact, your urban centers are supposed to be. The road, a great document called the Sustainable Street Network Principles that you can obtain from the CNU website. It's fundamentally this, and this is Milwaukee. The problem in Milwaukee was there was basically three ways on and off the highway. That's what created congestion. Everyone was used to hurry up to wait to get on and off the highway. What we did is we actually took this out. So that beautiful diagram that we would spend our public infrastructure. So it's not about an example of when we need 2020 traffic will be more jammed than ever. That is gone about ways to pay for roads. We all are very clear and understand the difficulty of raising the gas tax, right? And so because it's been so politically unacceptable, the purchasing power of the federal gas tax has in fact fallen. Both because of inflation and fuel efficiency gains. So here's the opportunity for us to rethink, rather than trying to figure out how do we generate more money, to pay for roads, how do we do it differently so that it significantly improved the right of way or the value of the land at the waterfront and has created a splendid place at the San Francisco waterfront. So many of you are familiar with the acronym is not so helpful. But in fact, in Denver, when we created how these surface parking lots and elevated highway might be, at some point, the Park East Freeway would need to be replaced. It's not like a Roman aqueduct, right? And so we had placed, from a perspective of city policy, we had put in place that our point of view is that we'd rather have new development there. And the opportunity came sooner than we had expected. Harley-Davidson, the highway needed. So what has happened in Milwaukee, a recommendation of the land. It would be a very useful way of ensuring that the development not only happened in the way the city envisions it, but also in a way that the city might be able to ensure that a range of benefits beyond just development and tax base, but other community benefits could be negotiated. But fundamentally, what this takes, taking freeways out of cities and replacing them with rich street networks, it's not technical. We can do it, right? We have examples from across the world that when the freeway came out, it got better. There's not a single example of a freeway going in and cutting through a neighborhood where the neighborhood got better. Every time we take them out, they get better. But what it takes is leadership, because it's not technical, it's political. And there has been some we need to recognize. And the focus here is to towns of American cities. Those are all focused on the long trip. Third, decision processes.
Now I'm going to bring up my slides, excuse me. And I want to ask a question, which is, how many of you are elected officials and how many of you aren't? And you're both relevant, so I'm not trying to separate the wheat from the chaff. You're all wheat, but I'd like to know how many actually are elected officials, because both elected officials and non-elected officials have a key role in this process. So while you're filling that out, 1% are elected officials. All right, well, more of you need to run in the next election. While you're filling that out, or you have filled it out, I want to make sure and bring up that in Milwaukee, the freeways were running through. The opposition was almost totally local, and so the opposition was mostly coming from people that were going to lose a house and the government wasn't going to pay them much for the problem. But that wasn't the only problem. The biggest problem was it was changing the way Milwaukee worked. Milwaukee's downtown was the #1 retail center in the state of Wisconsin when it had streetcars and no freeways at all. After all the streetcars were taken out and the freeways were put in place, it wasn't even in the top 10. The retail was degraded in the city. People moved out of the city. The city's population peaked at 741,000 in 1960. And by the time I became mayor, it was at around 600,000. So that was disturbing to me. And there are a lot of reasons. There were all kinds of problems that were created that I identified, like urban renewal and the way the Federal Housing Administration had a preference for suburban housing over city housing, all kinds of things you could go into, but one of the ingredients was freeways. So I ran for office against a big freeway supporter in the legislature in the state house in Wisconsin. I beat him. He had been in elective office for 14 years. I beat him. It was a big surprise. I had no interest groups on my side. And a few years later, I convinced Governor Pat Lucey to kill the Stadium South Freeway in Milwaukee. And I went on from there and helped. We had a coalition of legislators who were elected in Milwaukee, and we killed 3 more freeway segments. But after doing all that, with the help of Peter Park, we came up with the idea of not only could we stop freeways from being built, but we could also remove them. And at that point, I ran into some very stiff opposition because it's totally counterintuitive. If you have 50,000, 100,000, 150,000 vehicles driving on a road every day, a freeway, people can't have a hard time imagining being without it. So freeways were popular still in the 1960s. There were referenda held. Even in the 1970s, they were still popular in Milwaukee, except for right in the corridors where they were about to be built. So we were running against something that seemed like it was part of the American dream, and it was tough. So I had to organize. And I had to talk to the people and explain and make allies. And it took a long time to win. And we didn't win everything. But we started out by fighting against this dream. So the first slide I have up is the Reichs Autobahn, or the Autobahn as we call it here. The German Autobahn, which was to connect cities. And it was a very idealistic and popular thing. It's still popular to this day. And it was meant to connect cities, as Peter pointed out in his presentation, not to go through cities. But if you look at the congestion, the pictures of congestion in the early part of the 20th century, you can see how it seemed logical to people to somehow cut through the congestion and let vehicles go quickly through a city. And so he ended up with roads like the Cross Bronx Expressway, which was built after World War II, cutting right through a very intense street fabric to speed up the traffic. And even well before that, back in the 1920s, 1923, Le Corbusier, the great Swiss architect, came up with the idea of the intellectual idea of moving freeways through cities, separating the cars from the pedestrians, getting the pedestrians out of the way, and running through the cities. And this was his plan for the Jewish quarter, the Marais neighborhood in Paris. It was never built, but in Paris, but his plan, you can see it in Crystal City, Virginia, near the Reagan Airport, where the Jefferson Davis Highway, a great separated highway, runs right through the center of Crystal City. But it wasn't built in the Marais. Here's a picture of that part of Paris. This is what Corbusier wanted to do. He wanted to simplify things, have the housing with the housing, the road with the road, the people separated from the vehicles. And it would have destroyed the Marais, this neighborhood, the Jewish quarter. Fortunately, it's still there. But this dream was carried out in Brazil, in Brasilia. The architect Oscar Niemeyer and others designed Brasilia with all of the major streets grade separated, very long blocks and not very walkable. It works as far as, except during peak hour, it works very well for moving vehicles quickly, but it's not very good for adding life to the city. So if you want to go to a great restaurant or have a great time at night, you can go to the slums outside of Brasilia, the favela they call them, if you want to find something interesting. So there are side effects to Corbusier's dream. And these side effects aren't recognized by most of the training and technical procedures that people learn in school. I have a master's degree in public administration, so I got a little taste of planning and a little bit about traffic engineering while I was there. And this is a drawing that the Wisconsin Department of Transportation produced that shows the grade separated roads, the freeway, the arterial road, which is the stuff that they like to build. And then the local roads you can see in the upper left-hand corner, that's something that they didn't feel was important enough for them to be that involved with. So you end up with roads like this put into cities. This is Highway 81, Interstate 81 in Syracuse. And interstate, that just tells you right there that the purpose of the road is long trips. Whereas the value of the city is often on the local grid. That's where most of the value is, not next to the freeways or along freeways. And so the DOTs at the federal level, and most of them at the state level, with the exception, of course, of Maryland, don't really put a lot of value in moving on foot. They put some value on moving on transit, but somebody can make the same amount of money as a salary and work right next to a person who drives 20 miles to work and somebody who walks right across the street to work. So the value of the pedestrian trip to work is just as valuable as a long car trip is to work without the cost. And that needs to be factored in. And if it is, then you'll tend to come to a different conclusion about what works. This is Highway 81 in Syracuse, which they're now considering removing. The New York DOT, to its great credit, opened its mind, and they're now, their number one choice is to remove it and replace it with a boulevard. The street grid is valuable. As Peter pointed out, there's multiple ways to get around. It connects everything exactly, and you have the same number of lanes. They're just not all on the same road. And when you bring in a big road, it disrupts it. And to what end? I mean, it works great at 2 a.m., but this is one of the freeways in Houston that congested when Hurricane Rita was about to hit. And so the road came to a complete standstill. Over 100 people actually died in various ways. The biggest number in a fire that happened on a bus on the freeway. Everything came to a halt. And the theory behind this was somehow that the interstate was a defense escape route, so that if the Russians launched one of their ICBMs at Houston or any other big city, you would jump on the freeway and get out of town before the bomb went off. But Rita proved that that's not what would happen. That even the security reason for it, the military reason for it, is questionable. So maybe the biggest damage, though, of this kind of thinking isn't the freeways themselves, but even in small towns, medium towns, big towns, neighborhoods all across the country, was the idea that the main purpose of the street, maybe the only purpose of the street, is to move traffic. That's all you need to measure. And you can get a picture for what happened. This is Brainerd, Minnesota, back in the 1940s. This was their main street, and this is the way it is today. There's not a lot going on. There's plenty of there's plenty of pavement to travel on, and the stoplights are easy to see. They're right over the street, but there wasn't care put into maintaining the value added of the street. Another stark example is Gary, Indiana. This is Gary, Indiana in 1949, and then the same street, Michigan Avenue, today. Now, the urban street is coming back. The millennials like urban living. Not all of them, but most of them do. And this is North Avenue, Damon, and Milwaukee Avenue, the big intersection that's at the center of Bucktown and in the middle of Chicago's northwest side. And the thing you can see about these streets is that they're congested. Look how congested it is with people, traffic, cars, real estate value, restaurants, all this stuff happening on the street, and there's only one moving lane in each direction. There's a parking lane on each side, and it's even open for parking during rush hour. There's no time of day restrictions because the retailers have more power. This is one of the benefits of corruption in Chicago. The retailers and the restaurant owners and bar owners are more likely to show up at the alderman's fundraiser than traffic engineer will. And so they win, and they've managed to have the street be for them. And it adds tremendous value to the real estate tax base of Chicago. In Toronto, the same thing. Dundas Street, which is a streetcar route, it's congested hopelessly, but so what? It's congested with money. The reason it's congested is because people want to be there. You can have a street that's not congested by making it so ugly that nobody will ever want to be there, and the cars will move very quickly through it. But then when the local government tries to collect taxes, they come up almost empty. This is in Indianapolis, one of the neighborhoods right near downtown that has been successful. Or in Milwaukee, the old Brady Street, the old Italian neighborhood where Frankie Balistreri, the head of a local organization I won't mention, would hold court every day and meet people like Sam Giancana from Chicago. But the street is a beautiful street. Everybody wants to be on it. But if you want to drive fast, it's not the place where you want to go. Or LaSalle Street in Chicago, which actually, even though it's a street that's beautiful and has tremendous real estate value, it has 2 moving lanes in each direction. And at rush hour, it actually moves faster than Lakeshore Drive or I-94 because it has lots of intersections. Every block has an intersection, so the street never quite comes to a dead standstill. And that's the problem with freeways in urban places. It concentrates traffic. It has long distances between the nodes where you can get off, and so you're trapped on it at peak hour. Now, in the streets that are built on the edges of cities tend to be of one type. The width will vary, but usually it has 12-foot lanes. In this case, 72 feet of pavement with a median big enough for left turn lanes in each direction. Here's another version of it. But the value added from it is lower, often lower, even if it's in a relatively wealthy suburb. If you measure it by per acre, the value will be less than it is even in some neighborhoods that are struggling in denser populated parts of the city or older suburbs. All right, now I want to get to a real stark example. I'm going to go quickly to get to the end of this because I know I want to stay within our time constraints. This is New Orleans. And in 1950s, they made a decision to build a freeway over this street, which has Claiborne Avenue, which at that time had over 2,000 live oak trees along its 3-mile stretch, a boulevard with 247 businesses along it. And Louis Armstrong, a lot of the black upper class and the Creole upper class lived along this street. And in 1966, they started tearing down, they tore down all the live oak trees and then built the freeway up on top of it. And today it has 27 businesses along the same stretch. It's not fun to walk along it. It's noisy and dirty, but it could be replaced. And there's several aldermen on the New Orleans City Council that are working hard to try to get it replaced. It's on CNU's list of freeways that are good candidates for tearing down. And so the plan is just to put the boulevard back in. And it would probably work pretty well. There was one freeway that wasn't built that was right in front of the Vieux Carré in the French Quarter, and the wealthy property owners in that area were successful in blocking it. But just imagine if the St. Louis Cathedral and the French Quarter had a double-deck freeway separating it from the Mississippi River, what that would be like. Now, cities that go through a calamity can rebuild. People often, the whole theory behind urban renewal was let's tear down the old city and put up the good city. But when the Germans had the chance to rebuild Berlin after World War II, they didn't build a low density city with freeways. They built back what was up there before. And that also happened in most other European cities like Warsaw, Poland, where the city was completely destroyed by the Nazis at the end when they were leaving, and they restored the urban fabric. So Jane Jacobs understood all this stuff, and she fought the very important urban planner Robert Moses, who wanted to build lots of freeways and really believed in moving traffic and wanted to move it through Washington Square at the foot of Fifth Avenue. And she fought him along with Carmen DeSapio, the head of the Tammany Hall machine, took Jane Jacobs' side, which is an important point. You don't need to just be an environmentalist or somebody that, you know, goes to coffee shops and wears sandals and all that. Like right now, I go to coffee shops and wear sandals, but I always recognize that you needed to get a lot of the other traditional members of the political structure involved. And Jane Jacobs involved Carmen DeSapio, who lived in Greenwich Village and didn't want to see Greenwich Village ruined, and so they built a coalition. And remember that if you're trying to win on one of these fights, you really do need to branch out and include other people, maybe people that culturally you don't associate with that closely. The worst project that Jane defeated was the Lower Manhattan Expressway, which would have ruined the east side of the village, part of Chelsea, part of Tribeca. Billions of dollars of real estate would not have happened. But she won that battle. And then an earthquake hit San Francisco, and the Embarcadero came down, which blocked the beautiful ferry terminal at the foot of the main street in San Francisco, Market Street. Now it's all restored. They also took down part of the Central Artery Freeway in the Hayes district of San Francisco. And in this case, it's one you should really study closely if you have a freeway stub in your community and you're looking at replacing it with a boulevard, because they did some interesting things here. Elizabeth McDonald and her husband, Alan Jacobs, did the design, and they tapered it down from the end of the freeway. Instead of just building a boulevard that could handle all the capacity, which is what they often say in Syracuse, the New York DOT, which has made the right decision about wanting to convert it to a boulevard, but they're saying, well, we have to have a boulevard that'll handle the exact amount of capacity that the other road would have, that the freeway would have. You don't need to do that. You can taper it down, because the grid is so vast and car trips have so many different ways they want to go that the traffic will spread out, and some of it will just disappear if you don't have the freeway. And so that's what's happened with the boulevard. When it comes off the freeway, it has two moving lanes in the middle. It has a lane and a half on each side on the slip road on the side. But by the time it gets about 8-9 blocks from the end of the Central Artery stub, it's down to one moving lane in each direction and a park in the middle, a playground, and an ice cream shop that's right next to the park, which you don't want to miss if you go look at Octavia Street. It becomes a street. And so you can restore the grid. You don't need to feel like you must accommodate the traffic. All right, in Milwaukee, which Peter already talked about, the Park East. The Park East was a long fight. It happened even before I was mayor. I was in the legislature then. And they wanted to build the Park East all the way to the lake, and then separate the downtown from the lake with an elevated freeway. And so there would have been freeways all the way around the downtown. Just like in Rochester, there used to be freeway all the way around the downtown. They've taken out a section of the loop there. So we fought this battle for a long time, and it was this one where we stopped the freeway and then redeveloped the corridor that made us realize that we could kill a freeway, remove a freeway. And I went through all kinds of fights over this thing. At one point, the state DOT resurfaced the Park East, the part you're looking at right now. They resurfaced it to try to stop us from being able to change it, but we just kept organizing. We organized the property owners downtown. Peter held all kinds of meetings. I held all kinds of meetings until we recruited most of the property owners on our side, except one, a guy named George Watts, who ran against me for mayor. How dare he do that? But anyway, he ran, and I looked at it like a referendum on the freeway because he lost. Anyway, The freeway was torn down. One battle I did lose, I wanted to save the infrastructure, the old infrastructure, as a monument on the street, but on Water Street. But Peter and I couldn't win that battle, so they removed it. And there's been all kinds of development downtown near what was the freeway corridor. The Harley exhibit ended up further south, but Manpower Corporation, a Fortune 500 company located on the site that Harley Davidson would have gone on. And now the city's enhanced the reduction of the freeway and the intensity of the street grid with a streetcar, restoring we had 350 miles of streetcar at the end of World War II, and it was all torn out by 58. It was a big mistake. All right, so this is Seoul, South Korea, where they've not only taken out this big freeway right through the middle of the downtown, which had 160,000 cars a day. They've also taken out 12 other segments in Seoul. They were on a freeway kick after the Korean War. They had a lot of help from the United States. And so our thinking at the time was infused into what they were doing. They built freeways all over Seoul. And now they're in the process of taking a lot of them out. In this case, a freeway carrying 160,000 cars a day was replaced with roads on each side of the river, which was restored. It had been covered up with 2 moving lanes in each direction with a parking lane or stopping lane on each side. And it works fine. In fact, it's a tourist attraction now. It's the biggest tourist attraction in South Korea. Well, second to a mountain that is religious significance. So it's the second biggest tourist attraction in South Korea. In fact, it's the second biggest tourist attraction in all of Korea because there are no tourist attractions in North Korea. And the guy who did this, Mayor Lee Myung-bak, look how happy he is after he did this. It was an unusual thing for him to do. A lot of people scoffed at him when he did it. He did it, he won, and then he was elected president. They didn't like so much what he did as president, so he's defeated the next time, but that happens. All right, now I'm getting very close to the end in case our monitors are getting worried about it. I wanted you to see this, which is a creek or a river, and it's in a wetland. And you can see that the purpose of the river in nature is not only to move the water, but it also nurtures all the plant life, animal life, and helps clean the water. And it's a setting for fish, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very complicated thing. It's not just about moving water. But in the post-war period of World War II, all of a sudden, maybe inspired by the freeways, I don't know, all of a sudden they started paving rivers and creeks all over the country in the name of flood control. But all it did was speed up the water and make it more flooded further downstream. And so there's something to learn from that. And you can see it in, well, this is a fuzzy picture, it's the best I could do. This is in Chattanooga, Tennessee. They built a freeway coming into the downtown, which dumped all the traffic at one big ramp at the end. And then they took it out. And everything got better. It was sort of like that song in the William Tell's Overture. Da, 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 da. It was so calm and wonderful because all of a sudden people could get off at different places. Instead of one place, they get off at 5 or 6 places. So you can read about this. You don't have to read, a Sierra Club magazine or something to get this stuff right. The International Traffic Engineers Manual, Designing Walkable Urban Thoroughfares, a context-sensitive approach, which they invited me to be on a panel, so I was able to write some of the stuff in the introduction. Anyway, it shows you how you can do smaller lane widths, how you can do streets and avenues and boulevards instead of grade separated highways. And if you run into resistance from the federal government, get a copy of the Flexibility in Highway Design Manual, which is their manual. They've had it for a long time. You can pull that out. If somebody tells you you can't do something, it's almost like taking a cross and holding it up. Well, I don't want to go into that, but I mean, it can really open up the argument and give you more opportunity if you want to do something like 10-foot lanes instead of 12-foot lanes. If you want to have tight turning radii, these are all things that are possible under the federal rules. And then finally, that's my last slide, but I want to just mention that we're living in an era where intergovernmental transfer of money is maybe coming to an end. It's certainly diminished and it may be suspended. I mean, there's a lot of talk about infrastructure funds at the national level, but nothing seems to happen. Nobody wants to, well, some people want to do the right thing and provide it, but it seems that when it comes down to election time, particularly one party, I won't go get political here, but they have this doctrine of not wanting to ever raise taxes on anything. So, okay, well, if that happens, that means that then it's going to fall more and more onto locals and to some extent states. But that means it's so important. If you're an elected official or you work with an elected official, if you put infrastructure in a city, it needs to add value. If it doesn't add value, it really, there's got to be some extraordinary reason to do it. But if you're a mayor, if you're a member of city council, or you're advising a mayor or city council, or you're a concerned citizen, you need to start looking at these things. What makes the city better? What increases the tax base that pays the salaries and pensions of firefighters and police and health nurses and so forth? And that means building infrastructure that creates property value, sales tax value. It means creating a city that can generate wealth for all of its citizens. So that's the main reason I got involved in this thing in the first place. I didn't want anybody to feel sorry for Milwaukee. I didn't have Milwaukee have to go begging hand in hand, trying to build a city on pity. We wanted to build a city that was beautiful and that people wanted to be in, and that could pay its own way to a large extent. And in transportation, that looks like the world we're going into. So it's time to look at these tax-based building alternatives to building these giant traffic machines that are rural types being visited on the city. Thank you very much. Oh, and at this time, Ben Crowther, the very capable staffer at CNU, will be taking over.
Hello, everyone. First, I'd like to ask you all a question, and that's who here has heard of CNU's Highways to Boulevards initiative? If you're unfamiliar with the Congress for the New Urbanism, we're a member-based advocacy organization that promotes walkable, mixed-use neighborhood development, sustainable communities, and healthier urban living. Great, so we have a third of you who are familiar and about 2/3 who this is new to them. So what I'd like to do today, rather than a presentation, I'm going to walk you through some of the resources available on CNU's website for urban highway removal and provide some context for them. And a lot of this material that you'll see, both Peter and John have been talking about in their presentations. So our website is cnu.org. And if you navigate to what we do, you can find our projects. And towards the top of the page is our Highways to Boulevards initiative. And what I'm talking about today can serve as a foundation for the second part of this series, where we'll examine more in depth the national trends that are going on right now on the issue of urban highway removal. So a bit of context for CNU's program. This was started over a decade ago when John was tenured as the president and CEO of CNU. And its goal was to track the progress of cities and towns and places that were either had removed, were planning to remove, or even were thinking of removing urban highways, and to capture the outcomes and results from those removals. And so our Highways to Boulevards website is divided into 6 sections. I'll cover 5 of them more fully today. The 6th one is the US DOT Every Place Counts Challenge. We participated in that with when Anthony Fox was the director of DOT at the federal level. But first, I'd like to talk a bit about the model cities resource that we have here. And this is a database with case studies on different cities across the world that have removed already urban freeways. And some interesting things to note about this is that it's actually, among the American examples, a rather diverse crowd. There's some larger cities like Portland, Oregon, San Francisco, but now we're starting to see smaller and mid-sized cities like Somerville, Massachusetts, or Niagara Falls, New York, Chattanooga, as John mentioned, Rochester, New York. These cities as well are starting to measure community progress and quality of life by a set of metrics other than travel times. They've either started to remove or have committed to remove highways in their cities. The other thing that you'll, when you go and you explore these case studies, that you'll begin to realize is that this is not a one-size-fits-all solution. You'll see that certain places, many cities opt for a larger multi-way boulevard. Some, like Portland or Chattanooga, repurpose a lot of the former highway corridor into waterfront parks and other amenities for the city. But other places like Syracuse have alternative plans, and this is in Syracuse, as John had mentioned, and I think Peter too. The New York State DOT recently announced, as of I believe last month, that they prefer the community grid alternative. And what this alternative to the I-81 viaduct emphasizes is a restoration of the city's former street network in place of creating one single overly large primary thoroughfare or boulevard. Our next category and database is what we call campaign cities. And these are all cities that have been nominated previously to Freeways Without Futures report. I'll discuss what that is a little bit more in a minute. And in each of these cases, what we've done is we've tracked they act as a repository for the history behind the highway's construction, the demographics of the neighborhoods around these highways, current proposals, designs, and plans to replace the highway, and the state of progress that each of these campaigns is currently at. And so this is over 20 cities that are looking to remove a highway. There's a citizen campaign, or in some cases, the city itself actually supports the removal of the highway. And it gives you a good state of the field as to what's going on currently across the nation. We also have 2 tabs here, one for webinars, similar to this one on different topics. We have videos, we have articles and further reading under our resources section. And all of these investigate different facets of urban highway removal. This includes things like traffic modeling and traffic outcomes for when a highway is removed, the opportunities to create new urban development and housing out of land occupied by highway corridors. There's also, in these 2 tabs, strategies to make certain that local residents are not displaced by new development, and how to ensure that the economic value unlocked by taking down an elevated expressway is channeled to those residents. And that helps serve the entire community and not just a segment of it. And finally, we have our Freeways Without Futures reports. And this report is published every 2 years. It examines 10 urban freeways whose removal would create for the cities they're located in economic gains, a vibrant public realm, and a healthier environment. And the report is created through this process. We put out a national call for nominations, and then we convene a jury of transportation and urban design experts with highway removal experience, and they evaluate the applications. And the metrics that they do so are a good set of metrics that can be applied within communities who want to consider removing a highway in their own backyard. And so these experts look at the age and state of the highway, the quality of alternative designs, that includes boulevard, street designs, the community support that's already in place for the highway removal, any existing momentum on the political level, whether that's with local government, state government, federal government, opportunities for redevelopment, and we saw that illustrated excellently in our 2 previous presentations. The potential cost savings, so this is in terms of having to spend money to maintain the elevated expressway. In comparison, how much money will it cost to maintain the street at grade? Usually, almost always, the answer is less. And the potential to improve access for underserved communities. Many of these highways were constructed through minority neighborhoods that didn't have the political power or capital in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. And so they've severed those neighborhoods from other parts of the cities, and there's an opportunity to reintegrate and restore, make complete the city again. In our 2019 Freeways Without Futures report, we've noticed several trends emerging. There's an increasing pace for urban highway removal. Since 2017, 4 cities, Seattle, Detroit, Rochester, and Syracuse now, have either begun removing a highway or committing to it. The second trend that we've noticed is in terms of traffic outcomes, it's possible to transform a highway into a boulevard without the addition of costly auto infrastructure like tunnels. Earlier this year, Seattle's Alaskan Way Viaduct in January was slated for demolition as part of transforming Seattle's waterfront. It was closed for 3 weeks before the tunnel that was dug underneath it to replace it was to be opened. And so there was predicted that massive Carmageddon and gridlock would ensue in these 3 weeks. How would the city streets possibly handle the 90,000 vehicles a day that traveled on the Alaskan Way Viaduct? And the traffic data showed that car commuting times rose slightly, but there was not widespread gridlock nor Carmageddon. There was a bit of an uptick actually in public transit ridership and bike users at this time. But for the most part, it appears that the 90,000 vehicles simply dispersed along other routes in the city street network, and no one single street carried the entire load. And that actually goes back to the point that John was making earlier. And the final bit that I'd like to say that we've noticed at CNU is that cities are realizing if they plan to remove a highway, they have to offer alternative options to driving. So the removal of a highway is a large divestment from expensive auto infrastructure. And the construction of a new street or boulevard can incorporate relatively inexpensive forms of public transportation into its design, such as bus rapid transit with dedicated lanes that can serve former automobile users. And this really helps in terms of the neighborhoods around highway corridors, as many of them lack effective public transit now, and the highway removal is an opportunity to remedy this. So with that, please feel free to explore our website and see some of the resources there. And I will turn it back over to our moderators for our question and answer session.
Great, thank you, Ben. So throughout this webinar, we've been assembling the questions posed by the audience, and we're now going to move into the question and answer session. We'll continue here till about 2:30, and move forward. We'll actually have Ben and John and Peter put their cameras on so you can take a look at them while we're having our question and answer session. So thank you very much. So just to start, I guess a question that came up during the beginning of the presentation, I think, Peter, when you were talking, before you remove the road, don't you also need to think about how you need to accommodate traffic and the shifting of travel patterns? Don't you need to provide some substitution of mode alternatives?
Yes, you need to look at that. But the starting point is, what kind of place do you want to create, right? Streets have a lot of capacities. The existing road networks, as Ben was mentioning, and the cases that we were finding, there's a lot of existing capacity in the existing street system. What happened in many cities is the network of streets was manipulated in a way to provide those few access points to the limited access highway, right, that cut through it. And then those streets often were created into one-ways that become these long, sort of extended on and off ramps. So it really is this, it's really a traffic sewer system, right? And what you find at peak periods is there's congestion on the streets that lead to the on and off ramps, but all the other streets you can get around pretty easily, right? So yeah, I mean, one needs to pay attention to that, but the fundamental difference here is that the purpose is to figure out and reveal how we can improve cities, improve places for people, right? The traffic and the considerations for the traffic are secondary to that.
John, did you want to add something to that?
Well, it's just the city of San Francisco showed that with both the central artery and the Embarcadero, that the majority of trips actually were shorter in time because there was more connectivity. So you need to account for the connectivity benefit. And I think that in a lot of engineering schools now, traffic engineering, they're starting to look for that connectivity benefit. I know the ITE is aware of it. So even if of course you have to try to figure out what's going to happen to the traffic, but you have to measure it a little bit differently, study what's happened in other places, and realize that in many cases, the traffic moved pretty well before the freeway was built. So you remove the freeway and it'll return to some extent to a norm that existed before.
Okay, kind of in a similar vein, do you have or know of any studies on the value of a land adjacent to the different types of roads? And we talked a little bit about that, but has there been any research done?
Well, it's a hard thing to do because real estate values depend on all kinds of different things. I actually stopped a study that we started to do because I didn't think it was fair. We were going to measure the value of the street on the downtown side of the Willamette River where they had removed the freeway with the freeway that was on the other side of the river in an industrial area. You know, it would have been an unfair thing to do. I don't know, like Emerson, Ed Emerson, is it the guy who wrote the book about cities? He does a lot of research, and I've talked to him about doing digressions and so forth, doing research techniques to try to figure that out. But you have to do all kinds of what if this, what if that, because values depend. I mean, a freeway in San Francisco, a freeway corridor is going to be worth a lot of money because the real estate market there is so hot. if you do a study in Decatur, Illinois, it's going to be a little bit different. So I'd be a little careful about making great claims on that, but you can see wherever a freeway is built in a city, it tends to be degraded. It tends to lead to lower usage like parking lots. And where they're removed, then you get development like in downtown Milwaukee. But I'm not aware of any really, deep research that's been done on it, and maybe Peter will do that now.
I would consult the Highways to Boulevards resources page. There's actually one article in particular that explores in depth the effect on price impacts after the Central Freeway was removed in San Francisco. It's called From Elevated Freeways to Surface Boulevards, Neighborhood Traffic and Housing Price Impacts in San Francisco. The primary author is Robert Cervero. And that's tries to account for the multiple inputs into changing land values, but really explores around that former freeway corridor the outcomes in terms of property value.
So this reinforces the point that I made earlier about that in the transfer of the land and the right of way from the state or from the Fed, that the land going to the city, the opportunity there. I mean, and John could speak to this. I mean, right? The city of Milwaukee did not have to pay the county or the state or the federal government back for the land. So that really significantly changed what the basis in the land was. And what we know is, right, the land in and around and under the freeway compared to just a block away or several blocks away is the least valuable real estate, as long as that degrading, corrosive element of the freeway is there. The potential of the land changes when that corrosive agent can be removed. And if the city has more direct control over that land, then to other goals that the city may have in terms of providing more housing, more affordable housing, more open space, and a range of things that Ben was talking about, right? The city can be in the driver's seat to figure out the disposition of the land and the land use. And also, if necessary, right, if there's a tax increment district that might be created in Milwaukee, we created a small tax increment district to basically level the playing field, because the land had been just consolidated into these super blocks. And so we used those TIF proceeds to build a new bridge, to restore the street network, to create the foundation for private investment to occur. And in that, in other kinds of markets, the city being in control of that would provide a stronger basis to compel other public improvements and other kind of public benefits that may be desired.
So on that line of thinking there, Peter, I was going to ask you a question that gets specifically to that. Are there any strategy for ensuring local control in land disposition rather than FHWA or state DOT control?
Well, I want to comment on that because there's all kinds of myths that are in people's minds about freeway removal that we had to confront. One of them was that you had to pay the money back if it was an interstate highway. And we couldn't find any instances where they had to pay it back. There's some where they didn't fight very hard. And in the West Side Highway, I think the state of New York was somehow lost some of their federal funds because of that. But we didn't have to pay anything back. Originally, the state DOT said that we did, and we checked with the state office in Madison, and the person there was very close to the DOT, said, yeah, we had to pay it back. So then we checked at the national office and with their legal department, and they said no. And then we didn't pay it back. So, you know, you need to be a little bit aggressive. You know, where the real estate's involved, it's like any real estate deal. You need to read the fine print, figure out what's going to happen, and assert your position. And there are other obstacles that come up, you know, that you have to have a certain kind of lane width or whatever. And that's why I said to get a copy of the Federal Flexibility Manual, have it with you when you're meeting with federal or state people. And there's increasing numbers of state DOT people that are learning about this stuff and changing their positions. And the ITE itself has really been a leader in this reform. And AASHTO is starting to loosen up a little bit. So you can get a receptive audience, but you're also very likely to have some people that just will say things like, well, you have to pay the money back, it's impractical, or it can't possibly work, you can't accommodate the same amount of traffic as the road has now. Well, if that's the issue, that's always going to be a really tough thing to win on. You're going to end up building a road that's almost as bad as a freeway if you have to accommodate the same amount of traffic. You don't. The traffic changes, it blends into the grid, some of it disappears, some of it goes to transit. So you have to fight these myths, and that's one good thing about another good thing about the CNU site that Ben is putting together, or has put together, is that you can get advice on that stuff.
John, if you can turn your camera back on for us, that would be great.
Oh, really? I'm so efficient here.
We may have turned it off when you were presenting. So I guess in a similar vein here too, well, you've kind of pointed out that the VMT has decreased. It seems that semi-truck traffic and truck parking operations have increased. We can see you now. How can a city address this issue if they're also taking down highways in terms of truck traffic through cities?
Well, the truck traffic doesn't really need to go through cities for starters. I mean, when the Marquette interchange was expanded over my objections back in the early 2000s, they said that they needed to accommodate the through traffic, like Schneider Trucking's in Green Bay. So one of their biggest customers is the Owens, Illinois Glass Company. So they're hauling sand from northern Michigan down to Illinois. Why they need to drive a haul of sand through the most intense, densely populated real estate in the state of Wisconsin, it doesn't make any sense. So if you have a bypass around a city, that's where through traffic trucks ought to be going. In Chicago, they don't take the bypass because it's a tollway, and a lot of trucks drive right through the middle of the city. If they didn't do that, it'd be a lot less stressful. You can't drive a truck on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. So that's one place they don't go. As far as deliveries go, trucks need connectivity more than they need big roads. They need to go to the place they're supposed to go. One thing you can build into a city street, there's a lot of what they call two-rod streets on the main streets around America, particularly in the Midwest and the West Coast. 31.5 feet from the center lane to the building line, usually with an 8-foot sidewalk, and 17 foot of pavement on each side, in addition to the parking. So you can double park a truck. A UPS delivery truck can park on one of these two-rod streets on a main street, and you can squeeze around it. Even a bus can squeeze it around. They have to go over the center lane slightly to get around it. But it's a perfect street for retail deliveries, and it still moves some traffic. And you got to look at those old ways of doing things instead of looking at the 12-foot lanes and the 72-foot street. If you build a street to accommodate, as Peter said in his presentation, more things than just moving traffic, these designs really make a lot of sense. So if you're talking about delivery trucks, then urban streets and the network are what make them able to do what they need to do. If you're talking about hauling sand from northern Michigan to central Illinois, it doesn't need to go through Milwaukee. Right. And something delivering wood products from Maine to a suburb of Philadelphia doesn't need to go through Manhattan.
And that's, you know, it's
George
interesting.
Washington Bridge, the George Washington Bridge gets congested even without Chris Christie's putting the signs up. It gets congested anyway at every rush hour. So driving a truck through the Cross Bronx Expressway and over the George Washington Bridge doesn't make sense anyway.
Yeah, you know, when you look at a lot of cities that might have, you know, ring road or other bypass, those are options, right? As John said, it doesn't make sense if the trip is a long one, that would run right through the middle of the core of the city. And any experienced truck driver knows that they're rolling through Denver during rush hour. Don't take I-70, right? They would take going around 76 to 76. And if you look at Google Maps and you look at the time, even though, you know, going around the city or not taking the one that cuts through the middle might be a mile and a half out of direction. In fact, it's the faster route. And if I'm on a 800-mile trip, it's going to make, you know, it's going to make a difference. So, or it may not make a difference. Even if it was just a little bit, you know, a few more miles out of direction, and it's 3 minutes longer at an 800-mile trip, it's not going to make that much difference. And the other piece is that when you look at many of these routes, if you look at the hazmat route, if I'm carrying a hazardous materials load, those routes are already going, not taking me to the core. They are typically going around the least populated.
Just one thing to really emphasize here is connectivity is the friend of delivery truck drivers.
Okay, that's a good point.
Access.
So here's a question. How do you start the conversation with state governments? And is there economic and travel data that you can begin to have the discussion with? And in that vein, how do you educate state engineers to explain these benefits?
You need a constituency, so you're not going to win an argument. If somebody is, you know, has traditional 1950s, 60s attitudes about traffic, you know, they always need a bigger road, more lanes, whatever. It's good to talk to them. It's good to start the conversation, but you really need to back it up with political organizing. You need to have, in our case, for Peter and I, getting the property owners in the downtown to largely be for removing the Park East was the key. A lot of these people showed up at the Republican Governor Tommy Thompson's fundraisers. You know, once they changed their mind, he was from Elroy, Wisconsin, so he wasn't exactly, you know, the urban kid. But after some of the property owners explained things to him, he softened up quite a bit. He went from opposition to support. I don't think he ever got to wildly enthusiastic support, but he got out of the way. And the DOT that was absolutely opposing the project for a while, they softened their opposition, and then we won.
Yeah, and you know, then that nearly mile of highway was no longer the responsibility of the state, right? It became a city street, and you know, the opportunity here is what I talked about earlier, is that this is aging infrastructure, right? There are opportunities in places where this infrastructure needs to be replaced. And the question is someone asking, well, what other choices do we have other than rebuilding it or building it bigger, right? What did that installation of these highways do for the neighborhood? You know, we got the benefit of seeing how much damage they caused at that time. And we now have a lot of evidence, as CNU and Ben is collecting and ITTP has collected, describing how you can take it out and actually it gets better, right? So yeah, there are things to think about, but the fundamental thing is every example has shown that the city has gotten better when the freeway came out and was replaced with a stronger.
One of the biggest factors stopping these things from happening is when local officials feel, hey, we're going to lose the state's taking care of the highway. Then they'll say, oh, if you want to take jurisdiction and you can maintain the highway, you can have it, but you can't change it if you want us to maintain it. We're going to, keep it being however big they want to make it. Take the deal, take the road, say, okay, we'll maintain it, because the tax base you're going to get along that road is going to pay off or along the street instead of the road, is going to pay off way more than getting that subsidy from the state, which gets, with state governments being in trouble and financially, they're cutting back on all this stuff anyway. So, I mean, right now, the state of Wisconsin DOT is always trying to push costs onto the local governments, utility replacement, all these kind of things. They used to do those automatically. Now they're fighting to push it the other way. You're going to benefit. You're going to get tax base. Do the calculation, measure it, see how much. When you get control of that land and you're able to put it back on the tax rolls along the street, that's going to make a big difference. So don't just take the answer and say, oh, well, if they're not going to pay for it, we're not going to do it. You can't have that attitude. If you do own it, you should take care of it, and you'll take care of it better maybe than they would.
Okay, thanks, John. So a couple questions came in regarding, they see the benefit here we're talking about in urban environments, but what about suburban environments? And is there a kind of a cutoff in density where this becomes an issue that perhaps doesn't really apply? Because we talked about ring roads.
So. It applies a different way. You don't, there are differences, low density, all this, more car ownership, et cetera. But if you take the suburbs around Chicago, for example, which have the metro lines coming, the suburban train coming in, they all have their little downtowns. Some of them are quite quaint and beautiful. And if you have a downtown, or take north of Milwaukee, Cedarburg is an old village. It is beautiful, like 3 or 4 blocks with coffee shops and all that. That's all things that you can do in a suburb. You don't, obviously you're not going to be New York City, but yeah, the rules of urbanism in a small town, urbanism in a medium town, urbanism in a big city, there are different varieties of it, but urbanism always can work. If you have a crossroads in rural Kentucky and you put the buildings up close to the curb and have a sidewalk in front of it and a porch where somebody can go out and drink their cup of coffee and look over the intersection, that's going to be a place that draws people. If you have giant parking lots in all 4 corners and right turn lanes and all that stuff, nobody's going to want to be there except to buy gas. It's not going to be a place people want to collect and enjoy themselves. So you can take these urban lessons and apply them anywhere, no matter what the scale. If you're in if you're in the Death Valley and there's not another person within 500 miles of where you're standing, it's not going to be urban. But if you have heartbeats and people can fog a mirror, you create a place, they're going to come.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and that's, again, it goes back to what I was talking about earlier of what's the vision, what's the plan, right? The difference is that highways that are in cities, in urban places, came after the street network was there, right? And it disrupted and cut through and did all of that damage. In many suburban locations, the pattern of the suburban development has been oriented to the automobile, has worked sort of in conjunction with the highway system and this highly hierarchical system. So if there's a desire in these suburban locations to urbanize, to retrofit, to create more walkable places and mixed-use places, then yeah, the lessons and the patterns of urban places apply. If the desire is to remove a highway and not enrich the street network and increase connectivity and increase mix of uses, I'm not really sure what the overall benefit is.
Okay, thanks, Peter. So just a couple last questions before we end. Have you heard of any strategic road removals based on the assessment of road or bridges so that you can target the removal based on the conditions and the cost to repair? One problem of removing roads is recouping the capital investment, or in other words, depreciation of the capital investment. Has that been the basis anywhere?
Well, in Park East it was, because it would have been way more expensive to rebuild the freeway, which had reached the end of its 40-year design life. So it was cheaper to go to ground, to have a boulevard, and then because it's connected to every block that it used to run through, that creates the connectivity and the potential, well, almost $1 billion of property value in the corridor and right next to the corridor. So yeah, definitely.
So part of, and so this is, this is one of those things in our advocacy that John has led, Ben is leading, CNU is leading, in terms of how we change the conversation and the criteria for the decision process on these projects, right? Because the normal process of doing an EIS or evaluating and planning for a highway facility, it's never going to lead to the conclusion that taking the highway out is going to be the better choice. It just, because the criteria does not include enough in terms of, well, what's the potential return on investment from a development and land use perspective, from a local tax base generating perspective, right? It's about how does it perform relative to its ability to accommodate traffic. And so changing the conversation and changing the criteria for these decisions still needs to go beyond, well, how much does a road cost? If it's elevated or if it's in a cut or covered over versus not doing it or some other kind of thing. The metrics, the elements that are getting quantified need to be more broad in terms of what the land value, what the land utilization, what the land use, and potential tax revenue might look like. Because that is a complete picture of what public investment, whether it's federal, state, and local money, what those collective pots of money do relative to the kind of return that they create versus again the model that we've worked under, which is the subsidy of the federal government and just spending highway dollars and being concerned that we're not spending it fast enough because we're running out of time, and so we need to build this thing before it's too late and we lose the money.
When you're calculating comparative costs, you have to think almost like a CPA, and you have to look at the fine print like a good real estate lawyer, because when we were fighting against the Stadium South, one of the arguments that the guys who wanted to build the highway talked about was the value of leisure time. And there was a national standard that was much lower than the one they were using. They would put the value of leisure time at some tremendously high value. And that was how they justified spending all this money on a freeway. But we caught them. We had somebody that looked at it. It was actually an engineer at the county who felt guilty about the fact they had done it. And a guy named Ernie Vogel, may he rest in peace. And he slipped us the details and said, look at what they're doing on leisure time. And then we confronted them with it and they backed off. So, I mean, it's not always that big. It's not like the CIA versus the GRU or something, but you do need to read, you need to know what you're talking about when you're dealing with these people that make assertions about how a big expensive freeway is going to be somehow better. It's going to be better economically if it's a street for the community it's in. And then if you compare the costs of construction and land acquisition and all that stuff, you're going to be better off with a surface street.
Okay. So one last question. Is there any movement or any of you involved in the education of those designing streets and freeways, as well as engineering students currently in school, to impact future designs?
Ben?
Yeah, so the CNU has definitely been involved working with engineers. As John has mentioned, we've actually collaborated several times with ITE in designing new sets of metrics for evaluating roads that go beyond just travel time and level of service. And I think we started to see this change in mentality come about in places like New York State, where the DOT there now has become really progressive with regards to traffic issues. Syracuse, that decision was just made. Rochester, in the same upstate New York area, is filling in the inner loop that formerly surrounded the city. And Buffalo is considering removing up to 3 different highways. And so they're working, the state DOT there is working with the communities in all of these cities rather than against them. We've seen that shift at least happen there.
Yeah, the next generation of traffic engineers and planners, the millennials, you know, they're much more computerized. My son's a software engineer at Lyft, and you know, they don't think the way they used to. And it's not just because he's my son, so he like ignores everything I say, but you know, they really understand issues differently than just following the AASHTO Green Book. It's changed, and it's changing very quickly, and that's a good thing.
Great. So, John, I will note that we get several comments praising you for your leadership in Milwaukee and at CNU and kind of championing this issue nationally. Any parting thoughts to us today? Peter? Anyone?
Well, just that on this question of education. I mean, there are people like Wesley Marshall at the University of Colorado at Denver and Norman Garrick at the University of Connecticut who are incredible thought leaders. Pardon me?
Yeah, Eric Dumbaugh.
Yeah, and Eric, and right. So I love that question because it does speak to those that are going to inherit our cities, right, and our future, and how are we training them, and what are we learning from past experiments. I have always described the Freeway project as an experiment, right? Nothing had been done like that before, and how we have plenty of evidence of how this experiment failed our cities, and we have plenty of evidence of when we do something differently, like take them out and restore the street grid and restore a street network that for thousands of years has proven to be the foundation of successful urban places. You know, we just need to continue to advocate and shift and educate to help people recognize that it's a choice. It's a choice of what kind of future that we want to have, and that the imperative of traffic is not the singular criterion for these kind of decisions about making cities and making better places.
Great, thank you.
I would just add that it's also, as Peter's saying, it's the future, looking forward to that, but also looking back historically. And you'll notice that both Peter and John used historic early 20th century photos that provide a vivid sense of how a street can do more than just facilitate traffic. And in places that are looking to remove highways and consider alternative options, look what's been there before. And that's a very evocative image that draws a lot of people to it and can make a really powerful statement about how streets are used.
Okay, thank you, Ben. John, did you have anything to end with?
I just would repeat that when infrastructure is built in a city or an urban place, it should add value to that place, unless there's some extraordinary reason that it has to do something, you know, that it doesn't add value. And I can't think of that except, you know, if I live near Yucca Mountain in Nevada, I suppose I'd have to accept the fact that there should be a nuclear waste repository, even though it wouldn't add value to my ranch. But as far as cities go, the federal and state governments ought to be a lot more careful about when they add infrastructure or pay for or help pay for or regulate infrastructure in cities, that ought to add value to the cities, because the cities are the ones pouring money into state coffers.
Great. Well, thank you all. This will conclude our webinar today, Remove a Highway, Improve a City. I'd like to offer a big thank you to John and Peter and Ben today for a great presentation and for all those who attended. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org later this week. When you exit today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Keep an eye out on smartgrowth.org and our weekly e-newsletter for details on future webinars, including a follow-up to today's webinar with CNU that we'll be scheduling within the next few weeks. Have a great day.